Today I'm going to talk about a book that pushed me to find my inner Zen in order to be able to appreciate it, and that is The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen. The Snow Leopard is essentially a travel diary, although there are a couple of journeys happening here. There's the physical journey that the author is undertaking, a scientific expedition, and there's also the spiritual journey that the author is on at the same time. The background to the book, as I understand it, is that the author, Peter, and his wife were making arrangements to get divorced when his wife came down with a case of terminal cancer, and instead he decided to stay with her while she died. Several months later, he decides to accompany the naturalist George Shaler on a hiking expedition through the Himalayas to check out the mating habits of Himalayan blue sheep and to see if they can spot the very rarely seen snow leopard. So the book is basically the diary that Peter kept of their journey, of their scientific observations, and of his own pilgrimage to various shrines and monasteries as he walks his own personal journey of Zen Buddhism. Now, like somebody who is traversing the passes through the Himalayan mountains on foot, I had to overcome several obstacles to get into this book. First of all, the sort of tone and the feel of the book reminded me of one of the most boring books I've ever read cover to cover, and that is a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That was a real slog. It's one of those things where a friend loans you a book, says it's the best book they've ever read, and you read through it going, nope, not hitting me in the same way. So there was that kind of parallel that I had to overcome because of the previous experience. Another thing is this is largely a book about spirituality, the focus being, like I said, Zen Buddhism, and I'm just not into spirituality. It's not my thing at this point in my life. So in the most important things of the author's life, the deepest meanings really didn't mean very much to me at all, unfortunately. Then there's sort of the personal circumstance of where I'm at in terms of my wife having left me. The whole shock of it has started to wear off, and I've really been going into some deep depression, and that sort of zaps the joy that you would normally find in activities like reading books or sort of the hobby and fun activities that you would normally do. So it's really hard for me to assess if I'm enjoying something at this point, which is a little bit difficult too. But the biggest thing I had to overcome is the fact that Peter Matthiessen abandoned his kids so soon after their mother died to go on an expedition where he had to walk along these narrow icy paths cut into massive mountain cliffs where one slip on the ice would have meant his death too. It just seems like such a horrible thing to do, and he actually references it first. The first reference to it is in the intro to the book. The introduction was written for this edition, I guess, as I think it's maybe an anniversary edition, because it's written well after the initial publication of the book, and the writer of the intro is talking about how the author had left his children, the youngest of whom was 8 years old. He had promised his kid that he'd be back by Thanksgiving, but he ended up being 2 weeks later than that, closer to Christmas time, I think, by the time he was home. The writer of the introduction excuses that by saying, sometimes we have to move away from that which we love most, and then immediately follows that up with, I have met a few readers over the years, especially mothers, who remain upset by that moment, and choose not to recall the fact that one of the hardest things about the Buddha's devotion to the truth is that he had to leave his beloved wife and son behind. Yeah, I'm not a mother, but I am a father, and I was really having a tough time with that myself. I hate it when people use spirituality as an excuse to neglect the physical responsibilities they have. And this was all the more emphasized by the author recording a letter that he received from his son while he was in the mountains. It's a little too heartbreaking for me to read right at the moment, but the author says, I think of the parting with my son on the day that school had opened, just a month before, a clear morning of September, of monarch butterflies and goldenrod, late roses, shining pine needles, of flights of cormorant headed south along the coast in a dry east wind. Alex, his son, asked how long I would be gone, and when I told him, blurted out, too long. I had driven him to school, and he was upset that he might be seen in tears. That's much too long, he wept. And this was true. Hugging him, I promised to be home before Thanksgiving. As we know, that wasn't even close to being the case. And then towards the end of the book, the author makes this admission. Peter, the author, was having a bit of a hard day towards the end of the trip. He says, now I am spent. The path I followed breathlessly has faded among stones. In spiritual ambition, I have neglected my children and done myself harm, and there is no way back. And I just personally never could get over the fact that this guy just dumped his 8-year-old at school, said, see you in 2 months, and was off into the Himalayas. And then you add the fact that this is not an exciting book, nor is it an intriguing book or even a particularly interesting book unless the mating habits of sheep spark your interest. The leopard may be present on this slope, for the rams are skittish. Even so, the rut is near, activity is constant, and George, the naturalist, scribbles in his notebook. Oh, there's a penis lick, he cries. A beauty. I mean, that's just science, I guess, but you should have seen what these sheep were getting up to, including a rather interesting amount of homosexual activity amongst the male sheep. But personally, I preferred the name of this particular bird. In the matted juniper is a small busy bird, the Tibetan Tit Warbler. The Tibetan Tit Warbler. I'm 12 years old. All that to say is, I sort of had to find my own inner zen in order to get through this book and find the delicate charm of it. I found that I had to not expect excitement or overly stimulating stories or anything like that. Rather, I had to get to this kind of zen calmness of just taking in what the author was saying about the mountains and his own inner journey. And that by sort of relaxing into it, I could find peaceful moments with the book. It is definitely very poetically written in all the descriptions that the author makes of the places and the people and all the experiences he has. He definitely has a way of describing things. And one kind of interesting trick that he uses is he uses adjectives that are kind of opposites of what you would expect them to be. These sort of beautifully discordant adjectives kind of snap you to alertness by saying, wait, that shouldn't go together, but yet it does bring a very vivid picture to my mind, and here are a few examples of that. On this last day of September, I linger for a while in a warm waterfall, in the moist sun, while my washed clothes bake dry upon the stones. Or this one. And there, on the low cliff above the rivers, silhouetted on the snow, is the village that its own people call Samdo, white prayer flags flying black on the morning sun. And then this. Still breathing hard, I listen to the wind in my own breath, the ringing silence, the snow fire and soaring rocks, the relentless tapping of prayer flags worn diaphanous that cast wind pictures to the northern blue. And earlier in the book, there's this vivid description. Now the air is struck by the shrill of a single cicada, brilliant, eerie, a sound as fierce as a sword blade shrieking on a lathe, yet subtle, bell-like, with a ring that causes the spider webs to shimmer in the sunlight. I stand transfixed by this unearthly sound that radiates from all the world at once. And then one of the more striking examples of writing is here. These days are luminous, as in those far October days in Tichurong. There is no wisp of cloud, clear, 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 clear. Although the shade is very hot throughout the day and wind persists, the sun is hot. Just to have the word clear, comma, clear repeated 4 times really emphasizes the picture that the author is trying to draw for the reader. Throughout the book, you do get the sense that the author is struggling to describe both the scenery, the fact that he's on foot in the Himalayas, walking these mountain passes, as well as the inner journey of spirituality that he's experiencing, and the fact that he has to somehow bring words to describe all of this. And he says, the effort to find ordinary words for what I have seen in this extraordinary time seems to have dissipated a kind of power. But overall, he certainly does a good job of, I think, conveying what he's trying to express to the readers. And he remains pretty down to earth at the same time, as a couple of references to dung make clear. He writes, "In a warm sun, children play, and women roll clothes on rocks at the village fountain and pound grain in stone mortars. And from all sides come reassuring dung smells, and chicken clatter and wafts of fire smoke from the low hearths." Never thought of dung smells as being reassuring. However, he goes one step further a bit later. He says, "It helps to pay minute attention to details. A shard of rose quartz, a cinnamon fern with spores, a companionable mound of pony dung." There you go. Found a pile of pony poop to be companionable. And then within this physical environment, he's obviously experiencing his own spirituality in the midst of everything and attempting to describe that journey to the readers too. And some of the things he says, although as I said I'm not into spirituality, do sound pretty fascinating. And here are a couple of examples. The first one from the introduction. So the writer of the intro again says, "The central feature of the practice of meditation and hard work known as Zen is that, as Matthiessen says, it, quote, has no patience with mysticism, far less the occult, end quote. Nor does it have any time for moralism, the prescriptions or distortions we would impose on the world, obscuring it from our view. It asks, it insists rather, that we take this moment for what it is, undistracted, and not cloud it with needless worries of what might have been or fantasies of what might come to be. It is essentially a training in the real, what lies beyond our ideas, and they are only ideas, of good and bad. Quote, the universe itself is the scripture of Zen, end quote, as Matthiessen puts it, and the discipline initiates its practitioners in the clear, unambiguous realization that what is. The world, enlightenment, happiness, is just that lammergeier in the sky, this piece of dung, that churning river, all of which have life and blood as our perceptions or ideas of them do not." So that sounds pretty reasonable. I can get behind things that sort of push aside mysticism and fantasies and all of that stuff, although in the process you are creating a different form of mysticism, so I'm not sure how, if you end up ahead of the game in the end. But he also says this about Zen, which I rather liked. Oh, and this might be what the intro was referencing, I've just now realized. "The universe itself is the scripture of Zen, for which religion is no more and no less than the apprehension of the infinite in every moment." It's an idea that strikes me as being kind of neat at first, but then the infinite in every moment is an idea that, as I sort of ponder over it, I like less and less, in the fact that nothing in the universe is infinite. The fact that it is finite is a big part of what gives life and the universe and everything else meaning, I suppose. It's an interesting thought nonetheless. The author also talks about the concept of the universal mind. He says, "Nen is mindfulness, attention to the present with a quality of vibrant awareness, as if this present moment were one's last. Mind is universal mind, of which individual minds are part, in the way of waves. The waves do not derive from water, they are water, in fleeting forms that are not the same and yet not different from the whole." It's another wider concept that I won't dive into now, in order to not go on a big tangent, but the idea that large groups of organisms can act as one mind. Like when you look at an ant colony, how you bring together all these ants and they function with each one doing its own part for the collective whole. And there's an interesting sort of bigger picture of a large number of organisms at work together that I was thinking about recently, which is, I think, why that passage kind of stuck out to me. He also mentions one or two things about the practice of Tantra, which I found to be interesting as well. In Tantra, the pessimistic fear of desire and pleasure that characterized early Buddhism was seen as but another form of bondage. An emphasis was placed on being in life without suppression of life forces, but also without clinging or craving. Tantra concerned itself with the totality of existence, the apprehension of the whole universe within man's being. I thought it was a little refreshing to see a spiritual practice that kind of embraced pleasure as opposed to seeing anything pleasurable as being wrong or sinful or whatever you want to call it. Because, I mean, life is short, so if you're not enjoying yourself, you're doing it wrong. Now, one of the main precepts, on the other hand, the whole idea of meditation and emptying the mind, is just something I can't get into at all. The author is describing yet another scene in the mountains by saying, "The hermitage is situated so that nothing may be seen but snow peaks rising to a shining sky. Even Shay is hidden by the slopes above the village. The effect is so hallucinatory that George, disturbed, is stirred to protest at the hermit's life and solitary meditation. George says, 'You have to have something coming in.' But the point of meditation is to let everything go. Quote, 'When your mind is empty like a valley or a canyon, then you will know the power of the way,' end quote." And for me, it's like, no, emptying your mind isn't what's going to reveal anything to you. In fact, if anything, we have too many empty-headed humans walking around on this planet already. For me, personally, I found a lot of satisfaction in filling my mind with the wonders of science and nature and the natural world. Now, there are a couple of little quotes here that touch on my own sort of point of view of things. The author is talking about Buddhism yet again, saying, "This is closer to my own idea of freedom, the possibility and prospect of free life, traveling light without clinging or despising, in calm acceptance of everything that comes, free because without defenses, free not in an adolescent way with no restraints, but in the sense of the Tibetan Buddhists' quote, crazy wisdom, of Camus's quote, leap into the absurd that occurs within a life of limitations. The absurdity of a life that may well end before one understands it does not relieve one of the duty to that self which is inseparable from others, to live it through as bravely and as generously as possible." I'm very much an absurdist and certainly dwell on the absurdity of life, but asking somebody to face life as bravely as possible is a bit much in my personal experience, given all the things I've suffered in terms of physical health, mental health, personal circumstances. The last thing I want to be told is to be brave about it all at this point. But I'm down for the absurdity, and I'm also kind of down for this other bit here. The author is reflecting on the changes that have been happening to him, and he says, "It is difficult to adjust because I do not know who is adjusting. I am no longer that old person, and not yet the new. Already the not looking forward, the without hopeness, takes on a subtle attraction, as if I had glimpsed the secret of these mountains, still half understood. With the past evaporated, the future pointless, and all expectation worn away, I begin to experience that now that is spoken of by the great teachers." People naturally think of concepts like hopelessness and nihilism as being horrible, depressing states of mind, and yet I've found a lot of freedom in not having hopes or expectations, I suppose. And the author hits on it when he says, experiencing that now. When you aren't hoping, it means you're not grasping at the future, but rather you're living in the now, in the moment. You're taking it a day at a time and not allowing yourself to be already affected by the future. And that is kind of a point I've reached. I know that for most people, the idea of not having hope is not going to work and is not going to be a good thing for them. But I've been through a lot, and I find it overwhelming to think of anything but the moment. To think about the past is hard. To think about the future is just as hard or harder. So I have to live in the moment, and I have to find peace in the right now. So that part was something that kind of hit me when I read it. And here's another bit of perhaps personal oversharing. The author is talking about some dreams, awaking from some dreams. He says, "Both dreams seemed more like hallucinations, experienced in the waking state, and left me with a morbid feeling in the morning. These dreams do not seem to evaporate. Can I be dead? It is as if I had entered what Tibetans call the bardo, literally, between two existences, a dreamlike hallucination that precedes reincarnation." There were times following one or two of my near-death experiences when I was unable to mentally process what I had been through, where a certain part of me wondered if I'd actually survived the event and whether the me part of me hadn't died, and that there was just some kind of shell living on. And then in doing some research on that, I found out there's something called Cotard's syndrome, where people actually believe themselves to be dead. And I thought, okay, I can somewhat relate to that in these instances. So when he talks about this between two existences, I thought, yeah, I've really died in terms of, well, how do you explain stuff like this? I mean, I've been through hell. I'm going through hell right now, and feel like in a lot of ways myself has not survived, and that I am kind of in a bit of a limbo state between life and death. But that's getting maybe a bit too deep for the scope of talking about this book. Here's another reference to something I read just a moment ago. The author says, "Whatever this man is, wanderer or evil monk or saint or sorcerer, he seems touched by what Tibetans call the crazy wisdom. He is free." If there's one thing that I feel I have in abundance, it's crazy wisdom. Some people might call that insanity. I don't know. A big part of Peter's journey is the people that he is on this journey with. So he's going along with George, this naturalist who wants to see the blue sheep and hope to catch a glimpse of this leopard. But they're also with Sherpas who are carrying their gear for them. And it's interesting to hear him talk about and relate to the Sherpas. The author's talking about how the Sherpas had built a fire to dry their sleeping bags after they'd gotten wet, and he says, "Like all Sherpa work, this is offered and accomplished cheerfully, and usually Tuckton lends a hand, although such help is not expected of the porters, and he is not paid for it. The Sherpas are alert for ways in which to be of use, yet are never insistent, far less servile. Since they are paid to perform a service, why not do it as well as possible? Here, sir, I will wash the mud. I carry that, sir. As George says, when the going gets rough, they take care of you first. Yet their dignity is unassailable, for the service is rendered for its own sake. It is the task, not the employer, that is served. As Buddhists, they know that the doing matters more than the attainment or reward, that to serve in this selfless way is to be free." That's quite a cool attitude towards both work and your fellow people. And yet there are times where I feel uncomfortable about the way that the two white men who are leading the expedition treat the Sherpas and porters. And part of it is the fact that this all happened in the early 1970s, so this is a different time and a different age. But there is an uncomfortable sense of superiority that the white expedition leaders seem to have at times. Here's one event that the author admits to. He says, "Earlier I resisted Tuckton's good advice that we make camp in open valley some miles back. This river makes me restless, and I snapped at him that we would never reach Jumla by tomorrow evening if we made camp in early afternoon. On other days I have complained when we make camp after dark instead of arriving in good light, in time to wash. The poor man must think I have gone crazy." So there is a sense at times that their kind servitude is rewarded with anger and abuse to a certain extent. But on a positive note, and one that personally really hit me, one of the Sherpas on their expedition received a letter from his wife saying that his wife had left him for another man. And it says, "Weeping, Fu Tsering had got to his feet and read the letter aloud to all the Sherpa villagers where they were camped, and the people had all stood there and wept with him. As George commented, a Westerner would have slunk off and kicked stones. You have to admire the Sherpas for being so open about everything. So open, so without defense, therefore so free. True bodhisattvas, accepting like the variable airs the large and small events of every day." I thought, wow, how different from my experience. To just stand up before the village and weep and share your terrible news and have them weep with you. I tell you what, that was cool. And then here are just a few kind of random things that I decided to highlight for one reason or another. To the east, a peak of Dhaulagiri shimmers in a halo of sun rays, and now the sun itself bursts forth incandescent in a sky without a cloud, an ultimate blue that south over Tibet is pale and warm, and cold, deep, dark in the north over Tibet. A blue, bluer than blue, transparent, ringing. Yet that blue went unperceived until quite recent times. In the many hundred allusions to the sky in the Rig Veda, the Greek epics, even the Bible, there is no mention of this color. So, on the one hand, we have this beautiful poetic writing, a blue bluer than blue, and side by side a interesting scientific observation that the ability to perceive the color blue might in fact be a modern evolution of the human species, which is quite fascinating in itself. Here's one thing that's slightly depressing. For a time I watched the coming of the night. A bat chitters and stars loom, and somewhere on the far side of this earth the sun is burning. Soon Mars appears over the dark split in the northern mountains where the Terap River comes down from the land of Dolpo, and in the snug warmth of my sleeping bag I float under the round bowl of the heavens. Above is the glistening galaxy of childhood, now hidden in the western world by air pollution and the glare of artificial light. For my children's children, the power, peace, and healing of the night will be obliterated. I heard somebody else recently describe the lack of ability just to see the stars at night in the Milky Way galaxy takes away from our existential experience of being in a vast universe. It kind of shuts out the bigger picture and leaves us kind of cocooned in our own kind of selfish thoughts and feelings without that greater context. And that, I think there's something to that, you know. And then here was this interesting practice that I thought should probably be done more frequently, but I can see why it's not. There is also a custom called air burial, in which the body of the deceased is set out on a wild crag such as this one, to be rended and devoured by the wild beasts. When only the bones are left, these are broken and ground down to powder, then mixed into lumps of dough to be set out again for passing birds. Thus, all is returned into the elements, death into life. That, to me, seems way better than filling a body with horrible poisonous chemicals and then putting it into the earth to slowly over decades and centuries leach out into the soil and groundwater and just feed your body to the planet. Seems like a great way to end one's existence, I believe. But again, just kind of a random interesting observation. Finally, I will close with this. The snow leopard is the most mysterious of the great cats. Of its social system, there is nothing known. Almost always it is seen alone. It may meet over a kill, as tigers do, or it may be unsociable and solitary, like the true leopard. And I thought, unsociable and solitary. Wait, I'm the leopard. I'm the snow leopard that this journey is all about. I'm the one who nobody sees or understands. All right, that's turning it into a bit of a selfish exercise perhaps, but I thought it was kind of funny nonetheless. So with a book like this, I can't tell you whether I think you'll like it or not, whether I think you should read it or not. It's the type of thing that, well, I think is going to be a Marmite thing, kind of polarizing. You'll either really enjoy it or you're not going to like it at all. And I don't think there's a lot of middle ground with a book like this, although I seem to have kind of settled myself into that middle ground to a certain extent. So maybe I have no idea what I'm talking about. My crazy wisdom's just rambling off again. In any case, I would like to know what you are reading. I'm always interested in talking about books and hearing about books, so please let me know in the comments what you've been enjoying lately. Hey, it's Josh. You know why I'm here. Sometimes you just need that friendly reminder to give a little thumb up, to subscribe to the channel, to share the video with somebody who would enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. Traversing the passes in the Himalaya. Another thing, then there's sort of the perks. The leopard may be in this enigma, because I mean, to live it